Health District, and I'm the emergency response coordinator for the Greenwich Health Department. So I hang my hat in 2 different locations. That's my paid jobs, if you will. Prior to that, I worked for JP Chase for about 30 years, took a nice package and got into emergency management because of my volunteer background with Red Cross. I've been with Red Cross since 2002. I recognize Paul. There's probably a varied group in here. Any members of CERT? Raise your hand. Any CERT members? That's most. I figured I'd have a lot here. Any Red Cross volunteers, past or present? Okay. Anyone a member of the Medical Reserve Corps, whether in Stanford or another town? Okay, so we have a varied background. The one joke I always tell when I train people in emergency management or emergency preparedness is when, zombie apocalypse hit, the only thing that's going to be left are roaches, bed bugs, Hostess Twinkies, and ham radio operators. Okay, and that's because you guys are so freaking dedicated. It amazes me. Yeah, right, with the box of Twinkies, that's right. That's probably the reason why he's still there, but that's besides the point. But realistically, I've gone in a lot of drills, I've been in a lot of real assignments, and it's the ham radio operators that really fill that backbone. What's your favorite mile again, Stan?
23.
Okay, just want to make sure I had it right. As Stan was saying before, like Rick, I forget the 2 names, it was Tom and Rich, one said you had to have a photo, the other one said you didn't have to have a photo, and if you had the finish line. Number 1 point of failure all the time, communications. That's where you guys fill that void, in my opinion. You come in, you're available. I've had people show up with tons of gear. I'm techie, but I'm not a ham. I don't have call sign. Eventually, I'm going to take the test. Paul's bugged me a little over the years. Other friends of mine that are hams have bugged me over the years. Eventually, I'll free myself up and at least get the initial license under my belt. Red Cross, if everyone remembers back probably 7, 8 years ago, there was a Stanford Red Cross, there was a Darien Red Cross, there was a Westport Red Cross. Kind of fiefdoms all throughout the state of Connecticut. Right now, everything's gotten merged and consolidated. We're now Connecticut, Rhode Island. It's one gigantic chapter. It's the state of Connecticut, state of Rhode Island, with the exception of our neighbors next door in Greenwich. Greenwich is part of the New York chapter. Between us in this room, I think it had more to do with the deep pockets of Greenwich. It helped boost up some of the Dutchess County branches that were falling apart, Westport, Portchester, etc. So that sort of is one reason why they went that way. But they're still part of the state, obviously. But we support it similar to, everyone's familiar with the way the state is set up for emergency management. There's 5 regions, right? We're in Region 1, which runs from Greenwich to Stratford up to like Trumbull, Easton, Weston, Wilton going across. There's 14 towns in Region 1. Red Cross, we call it Area 1, and there's 13 towns because you don't include Greenwich. And we support that area. We cover everything from fires, canteening. I almost wasn't here tonight because we got a call initially to maybe canteen down at the condos because they didn't know how long the bomb squad was going to be there and the police were going to be there. So I kept on checking, and I was in the parking lot since 7 o'clock saying, well, I'm close either way. I'm either here in the building or I got to shoot down the block.
Who's canteen? John the Baker.
That works. Canteen, and one of the functions Red Cross does is called canteen, and we supply hydration, food, water, snacks, etc. If there's an extended operation, usually by extended we mean 2 hours or more. So, for example, last year, the biggest one we had was last year. Remington Arms for the 96th time in Bridgeport caught fire again, and that burned for 3 days. So we did an extended canteening operation. 2 weeks ago, we did a canteening operation over at Brook Street in Bridgeport. There was a huge multi-house fire. It was windy that night. The one house caught fire, the second house caught fire, the third house caught fire. We were there for about 7 hours supporting police, fire, EMS, trying to keep them hydrated, feeding them, etc. So that's one function we do. The other function, and this is, again, there's multiple functions. There's obviously blood services. Everyone, hopefully at one time or another, rolled up their arms and donated blood to the Red Cross. I'm on the emergency service side, or disaster service side. And the main function we do is about 95% of our responses have to do with house fires or apartment fires. When we go, we ascertain what the client needs. So we usually will supply them with a place to stay for a couple of days so they don't have to worry about where they're going that night or the next day. We'll supply them with money towards food and money towards clothing if they need it. Whether or not they have insurance, doesn't matter. If they need that service, we'll supply that service. Okay? I've had clients that were literally squatting in a house that was condemned, and we gave them services because they needed it. Again, Red Cross is sort of believes in neutrality. We don't really care where or who you are or what affiliation you have. And I had a client about 6 years ago in Westport, had a fire down on Saugatuck Shores, which is a very wealthy community in Westport. His son passed away in the fire, and he was just, zoned out. So we got him into the Westport Inn for a couple of days, so he had a place to go, place to stay. We got people in to talk. We've basically broken into 3 groups within disaster services. We have what we call disaster action teams, and they're members of Red Cross that respond on some sort of coordinated schedule. Usually it's like you serve 1 week every 4 weeks, and you work from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. Okay, the pay's great at $0, but usually the calls come in at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, but you respond to the fire and you assist the person or persons. We've had fires as small as 1 person, and we've had fires where we had to open up a shelter and it was 30, 35 people, and we supported them in a shelter environment. The other side of the shop is what we call health, which involves volunteer nurses, which will support us possibly at times when we open up a shelter, so we have some sort of medical person at the shelter. And then the third side of the shop is mental health, where we have mental health volunteers that can come in. And obviously, if you have a cataclysmic situation like the Brook Street fire a couple of weeks ago, you want to try to bring in some mental health workers if you can. The interesting, not interesting is maybe not the right word, but the one thing I noticed all the years I've been doing it, most people aren't traumatized. They're going through the initial phase of what just happened to them. They're just sort of glad that, well, there's someone here to help them. I'm going to have a place to sleep tonight, or even if I'm staying with a friend, I know I'm going to get support later on, maybe money for food, maybe money for clothing. It's usually like the day after was when, all that adrenaline comes back down, and then the person really starts to think, what am I going to do? Or all of a sudden they realize, I just lost every family possession, right? My whole house burnt down. I just lost everything. I lost photos, mementos, whatever it is. And that's when it really hits. So we always follow up with people to make sure they're doing okay. We work closely with social services in all the towns, with the exception of Norwalk. Norwalk does not have a public social service department. They closed that in 1993. But they have other groups in town, churches, private organizations that support that function. And we also have the state social service department, which will come in and support that function. Since 2002, I've probably responded to, I should do a count one day, probably like 325 fires, probably 15, 20 storms, some floods. I was here in 2007 when Washington Boulevard area flooded out. We set up the shelter at Stanford High School. I think we were in that for like 3 or 4 days. The problem with that was we had to have everyone out of the school like by 7 a.m. And then they can come back in at 4 p.m. because they didn't want people in the school, and they didn't want to obviously close the school. But those are some of the things we operate with. We work closely with police, fire, EMS. We're the only non-governmental organization that's actually part of NIMS. As far as, we're part of NIMS in the sense that we have an ESF function, if you will. We have mass care normally. If anyone familiar with emergency service functions, they range from 1, which is transportation, to, I'm not even sure what number they go up to anymore, 21 or 22, whatever it is now. We're ESF-6, which is Emergency Service Function 6, which is mass care. And that includes sheltering, commodities for food, water distribution, cleaning supplies, etc. One thing we do is we train people in shelter operations, whether or not they're Red Cross volunteers. So some of you in this room may have already had some of the shelter operation classes. You may have already had some of the shelter management classes. Realistically, the Red Cross cannot support 169 towns during a major event, such as Sandy. Someone mentioned Gloria. I was in Long Island when Gloria hit, so I had no involvement with Red Cross back then. I was 87, I think, 86, 87. But we do the training because realistically, we don't have enough volunteers to support, say, even 50 shelters in the state. In this area, we support 4 shelters, 1 in Norwalk, 1 in Stanford, 2 in Bridgeport. And it has to do more with the population sizes. Bridgeport, realistically, during Sandy, had 5 shelters open, okay? We supported 1.5. We tried to support the second one. I mean, we supported 2.5. We supported the 2 we said we would, and then we gave them a hand, if you will, with a third one. But they started bringing in people to help. They brought in a lot of paid staff. The good news is Bridgeport got very proactive, realizing they needed more help, so they've trained, since May 17th, 93 CERT members. I was one of the trainers for all 4 of the classes we did. So they're being very proactive about it. And there's a lot of cross-connection between all of us, Red Cross, MRC, Medical Reserve Corps, and CERT. We tend to work well together. We also do a lot of just-in-time training. meaning if, someone shows up at the shelter and wants to help, we sort of ascertain what their skill set is and try to give them an assignment. We never give them an assignment involving children, and we never give them an assignment involving finances unless someone can vouch for them. And actually, well, technically, legally, in a shelter, if you don't have a level 2 security clearance, which is like a teacher, daycare worker, et cetera, you can't work with children in a shelter legally. Even if I know you, with my sister, I cannot let you work if I don't know for a fact that you have a level 2 background. Level 2 background check, so you can work with children.
Is the CERT clearance at level 2?
CERT clearance, it depends. Different certs have different levels of clearance. They have we call a basic level. And then there's the actual level 2 is actually fingerprint check. So if you had fingerprints taken and it was actually checked with the National Crime Information Database,
We did, yeah.
that's a level 2. That's a level 2 database. If you have a carry permit for a handgun, that's a level 2 permit. Okay, that's a level 2 clearance. So in that case, you'd be allowed to work. But again, it's only as good as the last time they checked you, right? All right, because we've had people, I know when I worked at the bank, we had people that worked there for 20 years, and then all of a sudden they were dipping their hands in the till because something happened. Someone got sick, the husband lost a job, or the wife lost a job. So, you're only as good as you are that day. Okay, but that's the way we kind of work things around there. In Stanford, we've been pretty involved here. We've been working with Lisa Rodriguez from the health department. Lisa's, and I have similar jobs. She's the emergency coordinator for the Stanford Health Department. I hold the same position in Greenwich. And we try to get as much training as we can in for the various functions, for the Medical Reserve Corps, for CERT. I've done some operations and management training here. We just lost a really good leader. Our paid staff person was a gentleman by the name of Steve Woods. New Canaan resident, knows the area really well. He took a job at Yale, I think we're Yale University. It was at Yale University as a continuity operations manager. We're in the process now of making an offer to an individual who's Red Cross existing staff, and she lives up in New Hampshire, so we're hoping she's going to take the offer. One thing about Red Cross is the benefits are pretty good, and the pay is not pretty good. It pays very low scale. So a lot of times trying to get the best candidate isn't necessarily going to work because they're going to pay at a lower rate. Prior to Steve, we had 2 other people that worked as the managers, or what we call the senior directors, and they left after a period of time because A, they didn't even understand the sort of the climate and the culture of the Red Cross, and B, the pay after they realized they were working literally 7 days a week on call for 24 hours a day. And in this area, you had basically the shoreline from Stanford all the way to Stratford. That's a lot of shoreline. That's a lot of coastal worries. And they were like, sorry, it's not what you're paying me. It's not worth all that responsibility.
To give you an idea, the person who preceded Steve Woods is now working as a groundskeeper at Sherwood Island, and she's making pretty much double the salary.
Right. As a groundskeeper, right, exactly, yeah. And I think she's liking it, too.
Yeah, I saw her.
Ronnie likes everything she does. Ronnie was good people. But that's sort of the synopsis of what we are and what we do on the emergency service side. Again, there's the health and safety side, where they'll go into schools, they'll teach CPR, they'll teach AED, infant CPR, et cetera. Red Cross, as a Red Cross volunteer, you do get certain benefits. I get 15% off my T-Mobile bill every month, okay, which, adds up, saves me some bucks a week, or a month, I should say. But again, what we do is when we go out, the first thing we tell people after we explain to them why we're there to help them, why we're gonna give them assistance, it's 3 in the morning. First thing I want them to know is, I'm not getting paid. I'm doing this because I wanna do this. I wanna support my community. I wanna help people. That's why I'm doing it. Okay, my phone, well, I carry 2 phones. This is the work one, this is the personal. They both are set for the theme song from Looney Tunes. So when it goes off at 2 in the mornings, my wife knows it's not a nephew needing bail money. It's Red Cross calling, and she'll just roll over and go back to sleep. All right, she doesn't hear Looney Tunes, then she worries. It's like, who is it, who is it? As soon as she hears Looney Tunes, she rolls over. So I kind of set that up so I know, and then usually I just go downstairs and leave her alone for the rest of the night. Responses, again, very similar to responses that you have. From the ham radio side, we need you to participate with drills and exercises, and we need to get you more involved. Because again, I feel you're a vital asset. Even on the public health side, where I hang my pay hat, we're gonna start to get you more involved in some of the drills and exercises. There's 2 groups that seem to always be skipped over, in my opinion. One is ham radio, and the other group is the people that support pet shelters. Pet shelters is a very vital component now with shelter. And a lot of times, towns will have drills and they won't include them as part of that plan. Well, in my opinion, why not? Because they're a vital link. We could use a ham at the pet shelter, another ham at the EOC, another ham at the general population shelter, and maybe another ham at another strategic location. It could be where the ambulances are kept, it could be the firehouse, whatever. Because we all know what happens when we lose power. Eventually cell towers start to shut down because there's no law in Connecticut right now saying they have to be on generator power. So after 8 hours, 12 hours, those battery packs go. They can't get out to replace the battery packs, or they don't want to get out to replace the battery packs. Okay? AT&T's done a pretty good job trying to keep their system, their UVerse system up. They put generators out. If you go sort of towards the back countries, like up in northern Stanford, you'll see a generator during a storm will be chained to their, I call them refrigerators. They look like refrigerators, mounted to the poles. They'll have generators hooked up to that to try to keep their UVerse going. Because most people these days either only have cell phones or they're using like a Cablevision, Cablevision, voice over IP phone, or AT&T Youth First. The interesting thing with AT&T is one or two of those have gotten stolen since like Sandy. I know there was one or two that someone cut the chain. And about 5 hours later, state troopers knocking on the door because you all have GPS in them. Unbeknownst, so it's like, is that your generator? I don't think so. Here's the serial number, you're under arrest. All right, so they do take precautions. That's one way to protect it. My personal experience with hams was we used them during some drills we did in Bridgeport a couple of years ago. And it was great because the inject I threw in, all cell towers were out and all landlines were down. How are we going to talk back to Bridgeport base? We had a ham with us, and we had a ham at the base, and they were able to talk back and forth. The one gentleman from our area who tends to handle most of our communications, both ham and regular communications, some of you may know him. His name is Larry Gross. He lives up in Trumbull. I think he's been a ham before ham started. He's like a lifer. He probably started it, when he was sucking a pacifier and then sucking a microphone.
Titanic, yeah.
Right, he was on the Titanic, yeah. The other gentleman's been with us for a long time is a gentleman by the name of Ted Bresky, who's not a ham. But Ted's been with the Red Cross for like, I think 35 or 40 years. And if anyone knows the history of the Red Cross, it was founded by a woman named Sarah Barton back just around the Civil War time. And the joke with Ted is that he actually dated Sarah when, in high school. So that's the joke we use with Ted. But he likes it, I don't know why. And he's not that much older than me, which kind of makes me feel old too when I tell the joke. But, he's only like 6 years older than me, so it's not really like he's in his 90s or something. But, so that's kind of a brief synopsis, if you will, of what the Red Cross is and how we kind of serve the community. We also do trainings. We do emergency preparedness trainings for clubs, individuals, schools, churches, any type of organizations, Kiwanis, such as yourself. I think some people in here probably already had some of our training, or have had, if you obviously are CERT members, you've had the emergency training as far as having a kit, having a plan, family contacts, what to do during an emergency. Your family comes first before you volunteer, etc. We offer that training. The other thing we do too is we have a program called STEP, which we go out to schools of 5th grade. And we basically, as I like to say, we get the 5th grader to drink the Kool-Aid so they go home and pester their parents like, well, why don't we have a CO detector? When was the last time you checked the batteries in the fire detector? Why don't we have an emergency plan? Where do I go if the house catches fire? We just basically inundate them with that type of information. So they start the process. Right? Unfortunately, in this day and age, you need to talk about stuff like all hazards. Right? We have everything from John mentioned just before, right? Boston Marathon, that was going fine, and next thing you know, two bombs go off within 17 seconds of each other. Thank God it was homegrown and it wasn't a coordinated attack. Part of my training is bioterrorism and IEDs and basically all hazard response. And if I planned that attack, my second and tertiary attacks would have been to the medical tents, which were right down the block. I would have taken them out. As soon as everyone got in there to working people, I would have taken them out. And then it would have attacked the hospitals. Right? Unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with these days.
So you're giving us ideas.
I'm giving you ideas. Well, you can go on the internet. I was going to do a presentation, but I said, it's 8 o'clock, I'm not going to do a PowerPoint.
Yes, Stan, remind me, you said that you're right next to a medical tent, is that?
Yeah. You're going to have to do an extensive
We
background.
don't make mile 23 this year.
Far enough away.
Far enough away, that's right. And again, everyone's been trained, what hot zones are, warm zones, cold zones. Most volunteers are placed in what they call a cold zone. Medical Reserve Corps, CERT, were in a cold zone until those 2 pressure cooker bombs went off. Now they're in the middle of a hot zone because that's the way, unfortunately, that's the way it happened. So you never know. But we do basically the same type of training that CERT does, same type of training that Medical Reserve Corps does. Not at the level of CERT. CERT does 20 hours plus additional training. We offer 3 different courses to our volunteers. And again, it's not just a disaster action team. They can just be responders to major events. So if there's like a hurricane, or say a big apartment fire, God forbid, they would say, okay, I'll call in, or we'll send a survey monkey. Are you available like this time period for the next 2-3 days, so you can assist us? And we do a lot of our communications that way. Again, my biggest fear is another huge storm. If Sandy was, trying to remember, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think the sustained winds are only like in the 40s or low 50s. Those were the sustained winds, and then it kind of ebbed and flowed, like went down to the 20s, came up. And that was really, actually when it got here, it wasn't even a hurricane anymore. It was what it was a post-tropical storm, which whatever name they decided to give it. And that knocked down about 3% of the trees in Connecticut. Okay, if we get a Category 3 storm, which is winds sustainable like over like 110 miles an hour, does anyone know from training or wants to guess how many trees are going to be down in Connecticut, percentage?
Probably 30%.
50, 60.
75. 70 to 75%. So think of the months it will take to restore the infrastructure, electric, roads, etc. 75% of the trees in the state, theoretically, with sustainable winds of 110 miles an hour for a period of 6, 7, 8, 9 hours, you'll lose 75% of the trees. The good side of that is we'll be the plain state after that because there won't be any trees left. But it's going to be obviously very detrimental. I know people, I live in Weston, and I think the last families that were actually literally cut out were probably like day 6 or day 7 after Sandy hit, because it took that long to, obviously you work for, try to free up as many people as you can, and then medical, et cetera. But we were lucky. We had National Guards troops that came in, and they were just, cutting trees left and right and clearing debris. I was driving around with my 18-inch chainsaw in the car, and when you saw the size of some of those trees that came down, I was just laughing because it was like having a toothpick to try to pick the tree up. An 18-inch saw wasn't going to do anything. Yeah.
We lost almost all the trees on our street already, so.
So that's a good thing.
So, Category 3, yeah,
Right.
actually, the last one took out my car that we moved up the street for safety.
But he doesn't have power restored yet from Sandy.
Yeah, he's the last one.
Yeah,
No, I-
but seriously, in
Actually, I only
Stanford,
lost power for like a day and a half.
and there were people in Stanford who did not have power for 7 days.
Yeah, we were
And not just North Stanford. Down here, some of the worst of the damage was down here.
Yeah, our business
and
was
by the
out.
time they
Water,
got
the
things
water
right.
caused a lot, it wasn't
Yeah.
just wind.
But just in terms of the trees taking down power lines, it took up to 7 days to get them repaired because there's so much of it. There's so many power lines, it's so complex. And then there was this one guy from AT&T who kept going around screwing things up. Terry finally got the joke. Now Terry,
But Terry's probably an old snack guy, right? Are you an SNET guy? Yeah, you can tell because he's nice.
yeah.
He didn't come from Texas.
So it was some serious stuff, and that's with, as Mike said, 40, 50, 60 mile an hour winds.
Yeah, even Irene, which is only like 30, 35 mile an hour winds, there was a decent amount of trees down. We work a lot with there's 2 main power companies in the state, CLMP and UI, and then Norwalk has like a couple of its own companies. I wish I remember, I always forget, it's like a mental block. There's one little town, upstate Connecticut, that has its own municipal power plant, and the longest I think they've been without any power is like 2 days. Because it's self-contained, you don't have to worry about getting, they take care of their own stuff. One of the questions I know CLMP and UI gets asked all the time is, why don't you put the lines on the ground, right? If they're on the ground, they can't come down. Answer's pretty simple. The cost of running cables on the ground runs anywhere from $1 to $5 million a mile. There's 17,000, blah, 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 whatever, almost 18,000 miles of cable in Region 1 down here. Okay, we're actually, Fairfield counties are going up to New Fairfield, Danbury. Very expensive to do it. And where are they going to get the money? It would be from the ratepayers. So usually, so as soon as someone says, well, we'll triple your rates for the next 15 years and we can do it, then people back out a little. Okay, the other disadvantage of underground is it's not as easy to spot where the problem is. All right, it takes them a little longer, and then they got to dig up the road or dig up the dirt or whatever to get to the break. I'm the perfect example of that. I had a problem with the line. My house is fed underground, and they had to try to figure out where the break was in the cable. And they dug a hole here, and it was like damn. So then they dug another hole over here, and they found it like 5 feet from where they thought it was. And that was just a very simple 1 feet of cable going into my house.
And then you get flooding and you get animals.
And you get flooding, you get animals, you know, the proverbial squirrel, you know, roast himself up
it's
in
not
a
immune
pole.
to-
Right, exactly.
Yeah, some of the worst problems in New York City were in the underground cables, because
Yeah.
water got in and
They got flooded,
them,
especially
shorted
salt
them out,
water.
especially salt water, and so it's not a solution
So
necessarily.
nowadays, that's what they require you to
Yes,
do.
right, yeah, that's the flooding map, so,
Right there, you have the map right there.
you know, yellow is in category 3, this is what would be flooded in category 3. So, I mean, that's pretty bad.
Tom, why do you live on Sugar Area?
Yeah, Japan, well, see, a lot of Japan is okay
Yellow
all the
area.
time. But here's category 1 stuff, some areas that would get caught in category 1. But it doesn't even require the sloshing, it just requires enough rain. Rain pooling getting into the manhole covers, and pretty soon you're gonna have shorts.
Yeah, the projected tidal surge for Sandy, that's why the governor decided to do an emergency evacuation of basically the Japan area, and they had a lot more people show up at shelters here, was because the projection was 17 feet above normal tide levels. They actually peaked at 13 and a half. The storm started to subside a little, and the fear was the storm was so strong that what happens is the tide comes in, and normally it ebbs and flows. It comes in, goes back out. It comes in, goes back out. The problem was the first 2 cycles came in, had nowhere to go, so it stayed. Tide came in again, had nowhere to go, it stayed, so it started doing this. Luckily, it didn't hit the 17-foot peak. That was the main problem. Any storms like that, the number one reason why people perish in storms is flooding.
It was 3.5 feet short of going over the breakwater.
The breakwater, right? That's when
The
Malloy
hurricane
decided.
barrier.
Yeah, that's when Malloy said we got to evacuate because
Yeah.
again, it was supposed to go 4 feet more than it actually went. It would have been over the barrier.
Yeah.
The barrier is right behind my house, the bottom of it did not get wet.
Did not get wet. Yeah. So whoever planned that back in the 50s or when, I guess they built that after the 55 floods or whatever. They must have.
Yeah.
Whoever the engineer was, they knew what they were doing. They built it.
Tiny and, you know,
Yeah, they built it to a certain degree.
Yeah, to some extent, that was just an error. The governor's people were using, the governor was using people from Yukon, and Stanford was using people from Westcon. Okay, and the Yukon people came up, and they're using the same basic numbers as reported by the Coast Guard. The Yukon people, for whatever reason, came up with a much higher estimate. Because some of us, at least, well, me, I guess I was the only one in the room at the time. I was here when the call came in, sitting in this room, and the people from Stanford were saying that the governor's office is wrong. I don't know how they came up with that calculation, but they're wrong. And the mayor said, I don't care, I can't not do that in case they're right. So they did the evacuation, but the people from Stanford were all sitting there saying, we're on the phone to the Westcon guys, and they're telling us that it's wrong. Were you in this room at the time, or were you out in the field?
Well, what happens is storm tide predicted, say, at 17 feet. That's 17 feet above mean low water. And then you tell somebody storm tide is 17, and then they tell the next guy the storm surge is going to be 17 feet. He says, well, surge is the amount of additional water above the tide.
Above the tide.
So that's 24 foot.
Right.
And that's what happens. People get the term wrong.
Get the term again. Communications failure.
Communication.
Not getting the point across. Yeah.
And you get screwed up. You know.
Unfortunately.
Well, I want you to elaborate a bit on communications and how we can help. But
Sure.
just remember that we had people at the Stanford shelter. Krista Mish was at the Stanford shelter working with Red Cross. We also had somebody with Salvation Army, because at the Stanford shelter, which is run by Red Cross, Stanford High School shelter, the feeding is done by Salvation Army. The person we had at Salvation Army was not a member of the club, but is a CERT member who is a ham. In the hours before the storm really hit, like around 5 p.m., and Red Cross and Salvation Army had to get in touch with each other to communicate, it turned out they couldn't get in touch with each other because they didn't have each other's current cell phone numbers. For example, Frank Casella was running the shelter. Frank is a member of this club. The only phone number the only phone number that Salvation Army had was Ronnie Teller's personal cell phone.
Because they never got the updates.
And she wasn't
She wasn't
going to Red
in
Cross
anymore.
anymore. Our guys, our guy at the shelter and our guy and the CERT guy with Salvation Army got in touch with each other, and they were able to make the arrangement, you know. And basically, all it was passing a phone number, like, yeah, have them call at, 203-12345.
And part of the trouble too with I know shelter here and other shelters was even with cell phones, if you walked 15 feet inside the building,
Yeah.
the signal was gone. So that's again where the ham radio operators came in handy. Again, in my opinion, everyone knows what an ICS chart is, incident command system. It's almost like it's an org chart basically. You have operations, logistics. Wherever there's a box, in my mind, there should be 1 to 2 ham radio operators assigned to that box. So your operations, your logistics, your finance. So that way, if you do start to lose communications, you still have the ability to communicate with each other. That's key. Losing the ability to communicate with each other is not a good day. Okay, it's not going to get the job done. It's only going to cause more confusion. It's only going to cause more problems down the road. So if you always have that basically spare battery in your pocket, if you will, that would be a function that ham radio operators, whether it's clubs, we work a lot with Kevin Cellini up in Bridgeport. They come in. His group is, I guess they're an Aries team, right?
They're not
Kinda, sorta.
officially Aries.
Right.
They're basically CERT. They're not
Yeah.
legally. They're not CERT, but Scott
Scott Appleby.
Appleby runs them. Same as CERT. They have the same
Right.
insurance coverage. They have the same registration, same courses.
Courses, right.
And they're probably going to convert over to CERT, but they're not part
Yeah,
of
Kevin's
Aries.
taking training, and some of his people
Yeah.
have trained.
They're not part of Aries because Aries disowned them.
Okay. Yeah, they're a little gung ho. I can understand that.
Well, one of
The
the
hearts
problems,
are in the right
one of
place,
the
that's
problems
all.
that we had in Westchester with races was Tom Raffaelli, who was the races coordinator for Westchester, required 12-hour stints. A lot of the hams could not
Couldn't
do
handle it,
12-hour
right.
stints.
Right.
They had very few hams that were active during Sandy.
Right.
They needed them.
But it'd have 2
And they
doing
had
6.
people that would have been for 6-hour shifts or 8-hour shifts, but they could not do 12. So they lost a lot of operators that way.
Yeah.
And
Again,
Red-
hopefully
Red
these are,
Cross got rid of their communications vans.
right.
They gave them back.
Yeah, Larry cried for days after they had to get that van back. I mean, they spent a lot of money on those vans, and those vans were actually really well equipped.
Yeah.
But again, economy of scale, they had to decide what they were gonna do, so they decided,
Well,
we kept some of the
White
equipment.
Plains, the van was donated by the county, loaned to them by the county.
Right,
It was, all the equipment belonged to and was installed by WECA members, hams. Didn't cost them anything, but they didn't, when they.
But there's still the
But
insurance
they're
of
closing
Miracle.
the building down and.
right. Well, that's what happened here, the Stanford building closed, they sold that building, they got a decent amount of money for it, like 1 point something million or whatever they got.
Well, they still haven't been able to sell White Plains yet, but they're,
Right, yeah, they're still trying.
yeah.
But again, from our end, we could use you, and I think we need to use you more in drills and exercises, even if it's just a pretend call, whatever it is. And we all know, repeatedly, we always have problems with communications, getting back and forth. Just like John said, like they were calling Ronnie Teller's number, that's a lesson learned. Everyone right now, every 3 months, they send out a new list of contact numbers. Red Cross does, to all emergency management directors in the state, including Rhode Island. They get the listing of who their main contacts are. And that's updated every 3 months. It may not change, and we just send them the same one. We just date it, 3 months later, we just date it, and the number and contact information stays the same. Conversely, we get their numbers to make sure nothing changed. A lot of the calls I get is because of relationships I dealt over the years. Instead of calling the 800 number to activate Red Cross, I'll get a call from Art Reed from Fairfield. He's the emergency management director. He'll call me direct. I'll get a call direct from Westport, from Andy Kingsbury, or one of his subordinates. That's because we have that relationship. Ronnie Teller was the same way. They usually called her first before they would even call the 800 number, because they had that information. We wanted to continue to have that information. The importance, again, of communications, I always consider it the #1 point of failure in any operation. That's where it starts to degrade. Was anyone in this room in the CERT drill a month ago or so, right here in Stanford? Okay, I know John was there, right? Paul, you were there, right? One of the problems was we maybe had too many radios handed out.
Yes.
All right, maybe we just had too many two-way radios out there because there was a lot of crosstalk, a lot of stuff that may have been controlled better. So, but again, that's why we train and that's why we practice, because you learn from your mistakes.
Well, last weekend, Westchester County had a CERT drill at the county facility, and the only communications were via ham radio.
Right.
every team out had a ham with them, and they were directed from the IC, so that they couldn't move without being directed by one IC, and everything was all done together.
Coordinated through there, no.
If you have different, each one, even though they had their own radios, could not use them.
Good.
So you had control of what was going on.
And that's
how
vital.
and why.
Yeah, you need that
And
one
even with that,
focal point.
initially, we had some issues, but
Right.
those were worked out.
Well, things are always
for
gonna
next
bubble
time.
up,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, in the case here, the problem was they gave out a lot of radios, they were all supposed to be under control, but people just started chattering.
People started chatting, you know, it was like a toy, it was like,
Yeah.
Well, there was some bunch of people that had no radio training at all, I think.
yeah, there was a lot, actually, if,
That had the radios.
the one-day cert this year, on November 16th, one of the classes they're teaching is radio operation. How to handle two-way radios, how to use it, the proper etiquette, the proper protocols. Because that's really needed, a lot of people don't understand. The cert is November 16th up at the Connecticut Fire Academy.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Bob Kenny sent something out yesterday on that. So anyone who's ever a cert, it should trickle down. Again, if communications works right, it should trickle down to you to let you know about that one-day event. You have to be, if you're interested, contact your cert lead, whoever your team leader is, whether it's John or someone else, or if you belong to another cert. Contact them, this week, okay, and tomorrow's Friday. Contact them as soon as you can, because your name has to be submitted to the regional coordinator 2 weeks prior to November 16th, because that protects you under Title 28, liability protection, et cetera. They want to get that list in 2 weeks up front. All right, they may squeeze in someone one or two, but it's important. Everyone understands the Title 28. Even if you're a ham radio operator,
They don't.
okay, Title 28 is, we're one of the lucky states in the union. We have what we call Title 28 protection. It goes all the way back to the civil defense days, the early 60s. And with that, you actually take an oath. You swear an oath to the country and the state. And when you take that oath, you're covered for 1 year in case, God forbid, you broke your ankle during an exercise, not even a full-blown storm or whatever. You get hurt somehow. You have insurance. If your insurance company leaves you with some out-of-pocket, they'll pick that up. If you had no insurance, they'll pick that up. They will cover you. There was a woman that fainted at the drill that me and the gentleman in the back there were at. She fainted. Problem was, again, communication. Some people thought it was part of the drill. She was pretending she fainted. No, she really fainted, because she didn't eat all day. She wasn't hydrating. She actually fainted, and they took her away in ambulance. She had no out-of-pocket expenses because she was sworn in. All right? And by being sworn in, again, every year you have to be sworn in. It's kind of archaic, and we're trying to get them to change it. Speaking of Red Cross, I wasn't kidding, man. What's this one? 1 second. Now they probably want us to respond. I'm sorry, I gotta take this. Yes, Mike?
Under Title 28, you're covered if you're cert. John Solomon was one of the people, he's not in cert, but
Okay.
for Sandy, he was sworn in, right, John, you were sworn in as Andy Rosca and
Yes.
somebody else as what are called spontaneous volunteers, but they're sworn in by the emergency management director, which gives them coverage. So when John was up at, where were you, Ripplewam School?
Right.
Ripplewam School,
Okay.
he was covered in case, in case he
Sure,
was
1
injured.
second. I'm just looking at
If you're just a ham radio operator and you respond, you've got no
Okay, go ahead.
coverage, other than, your own
Mhm.
coverage, if you have coverage.
Okay.
The,
4720.
plus, the way things going these
And his
days
name
is,
again?
public safety is not gonna have you around if you're not part of CERT or you're not part of Red
Okay, I'll give him a
Cross.
call right now.
I
Thank you.
think most of you heard the story, the guys in Norwalk, when Sandy was coming, they got together, they said, we're Aries, we're gonna go out and respond. And they went to the high schools, they went to the EOC, they went to the fire stations, and everybody said, who the are you? We didn't ask you, we don't want you around here, we have no idea who you are, what you are, go away, and they sent them home. That's why I've asked, I've been asking people to take the CERT training, become part of CERT. You get the coverage and you get the training to protect yourself and protect your families. If we work through Red Cross, I don't know, Red Cross, so do you guys get Title 28 or not?
Red Cross has their own policy, if you will, so we don't get Title 28.
Okay.
I'm gonna have to cut it short. That was Lieutenant Davis from Stanford Police. They're gonna have to evacuate the area around where that condo is. So we may be setting up a shelter.
Oh, boy.
All right, so
You're gonna feed a bunch of
I'm
people.
just gonna go make a couple of calls, see what they wanna do. They're gonna have to get over to Tom tomorrow.
Well, take a couple of CERT members with you.
Any idea how wide the evacuation zone is? I'm 2 blocks from there.
They said 50 to 70 people, so I'm thinking it may just be the kind of mini.
Yeah, they were saying in the news as I was driving in that they had evacuated all the residents around them. And they were expecting that they were gonna clear it out and, you know, that was great timing. I'll have to pay them the $10 they offered to call, no.
John, you know that, all right, the federal government is shut down, but they reactivated the Hurricane Weather Service. And they did have aircraft up looking at the hurricane that's coming through. There's a good possibility it'll come up the East Coast.